Good morning. My name is Tim Doutre, Senior Manager of Marketing and Communications at Mind Australia, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Mind's Lived Experience Strategy webinar titled Reimagining Culture, Leadership and Workforce. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the traditional custodians of the lands on which we work, and I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And fittingly, as we have recently celebrated NIDOC Week, in which this year's theme was For Our Elders, I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the role they play for community and family. Mind also values the experience and contribution of people from all cultures, sexualities, genders, bodies, spiritualities, ages, abilities and backgrounds. And we are committed to inclusion for all of the people we support, their families, carers, employees and volunteers. And as will become evident throughout today's webinar, we recognise people with lived and living experience of mental health challenges and value their expertise, strengths and skills. Now, I'm very excited about today's webinar as we have a record number of registrations for Mind, indicating the importance of this topic across the sector and the country. And today is all about sharing and exploring culture, leadership and workforce through a lived experience lens. We'll be unpacking how Mind has actively worked to respond to gaps and opportunities through some presentations and discussions from those people who are actually leading the process at Mind. And importantly, we'll be exploring what meaningful change looks like and how we're seeking to enable it at Mind at all levels and how others can do the same. We'll have two speakers discussing lived experience, strategy and leadership, followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A session. So please, I can see the chat already starting to go nicely there. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation and we'll put them to the speakers in that final session. Firstly, to kick us off though, I'd like to acknowledge the passing of Anthony Stratford, a great lived experience leader at Mind, and I'll be introducing our first speaker, Mind Australia CEO Gill Callister, who will speak to Anthony's legacy and some exciting initiatives we're developing to ensure Anthony's legacy lives on. Over to you, Gill.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everybody this morning. I join you from Wurundjeri land and pay my respects also to elders past, present and emerging. So many of you joining today will have known Anthony Stratford. He was a former lived experience leader here at Mind and he sadly passed away in March of this year. He was much loved by many people. I didn't have the opportunity to meet Anthony, but I have heard so much about him. I wish I'd had that opportunity. And he will be much missed by many people who worked at Mind and beyond, because his reach was very far and wide. Anthony was one of the first people to understand and commit to work to develop an evidence base for drawing the knowledge and insight of lived experience into practice. He contributed widely to publications in the area and he had a strong focus on lived experience leadership. He is deeply respected across the lived experience movement and mental health sector more broadly, both in Australia but also internationally. So at Mind, we want to celebrate Anthony's legacy with continued development of lived experience knowledge and excellence that was so core to his life and contribution. And we want to do that through an annual lecture and an annual scholarship. The annual Anthony Stratford Lecture will invite a lived experience leader to speak to a critical issue of lived experience leaderships and excellence that would centre lived experience and expertise as a core component of continued mental health innovation and transformation. And the first of these will be delivered in late 2023, so this year. And we are also developing an Anthony Stratford Scholarship. The scholarship will provide a $10,000 contribution annually to activities that support the continued development of an emerging lived experience leader. The funding will offer the opportunity to contribute to activities such as visits to lived experience programs and initiatives, coaching and mentoring or leadership development. We'll share more details on both the lecture and the scholarship later in the year, including how emerging lived experience leaders can nominate for scholarship consideration. But I am incredibly pleased that we are able to create these two opportunities to continue to remember the legacy that Anthony has left us and continue to progress it.
Thank you, Gill. And some wonderful messages coming through on the chat about Anthony as well, including describing him as an inspiration and an admired soul. So please keep an eye out for the monthly MindView email in your inbox, or follow Mind on social media for updates on both those wonderful initiatives. Now I'm excited to be able to introduce Katie Larsen, Mind Senior Manager of Inclusion and Participation, who will be talking about the process and role of lived experience leadership at Mind. Now, some of you may be aware that Mind is at the halfway point of our lived experience strategy, which was launched in December 2021, and it's a key element of our journey to amplify lived expertise to drive reform and transformational change. And we're incredibly excited about what we're achieving throughout this process and what we still have to come. And recently we announced that an Executive Director of Lived Experience role is currently being advertised, and I think this really highlights our commitment to valuing lived experience at all levels of the organisation, including our most senior leadership levels. So please welcome Katie Larsen.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm delighted to be here today. As Tim said, I'm the Senior Manager of Inclusion and Participation at Mind. That's a designated lived experience role which oversees a division dedicated to lived experience, lived expertise strategy and operations, and work for inclusion for marginalised communities. My pronouns are she or they. I identify as queer, and I have a personal lived experience of mental health challenges and distress. Before I talk about our lived experience strategy and we delve into the work that we've been doing, I want to touch on what it means to work in a designated lived experience role. It is a unique and sacred type of work to bring the parts of who we are that have felt broken, been marginalised, carry scars and painful stories, and hold them in our professional lives. For those of us in lived expertise roles and other roles that draw from personal stories and experiences of marginalisation, trauma and harm, this is what we do. For me, this has been a mostly healing process with the most incredible support from many, not least my lived experience colleagues right across the country, and most profoundly by leading this work at Mind, where this is ingrained in who we are and offers a long history of developing and producing lived experience leaders. What it means is that I'm no longer hiding quietly in the shadows my experiences of psychosis, trauma, AOD use, phobias, crippling anxiety, internalised homophobia and shame, and disassociation, amongst other things, that caused and were caused by many years of physical, emotional and spiritual pain and impacted every moment of every day for a considerable period of time. These experiences have also forced radical change in my life. My identity, my perspective, my relationships and my work. With time and healing, they have moved from what made me broken to being at the core of my strength. Rather than hiding them so I could work, they are now central to who I am in my work and how I work. Now that is the real power of lived experience work. It doesn't minimise a person's experience as illness, as broken or wrong, but rather it amplifies this experience as truth, possibility, and over time with the right support, draws from wisdom and guidance to build a lived expertise. This lived expertise can inform genuine, transformative systems and social change that is grounded in justice, human rights, and relationally informed connection and care. That is at the heart of why our lived experience strategy is so much more than words on a page. At the launch of the lived experience strategy 18 months ago, no sooner had I closed my laptop from the launch event, taken an enormous breath from 18 months of work in producing the strategy, and Gill said to me, you know, the real challenge is implementation. I thought that's true and that's fair, because many good and aspirational intentions are captured in writing only to never be seen in action. I'm really pleased to report that we are tracking well against all deliverables sitting within the 4 pillars of our strategy: leadership and culture, design and decision-making, workforce development, and innovation and influence. We've seen major projects undertaken, exciting new work in peer-led service innovation in the consumer and family care space, new development and directions. Since the strategy commenced, we've seen an increase from approximately, we had around 10% of our staff in designated lived experience roles to nearly 15% and growing Our target is 20% by the full delivery of the strategy, and we're well on our way there. But not only there, we've seen an increase in a change in the scope of roles, and this has come through Mind's commitment to peer-led service innovation and workforce development and growth. This has made it even more pressing that we have quality systems and models in place to support a contemporary lived expertise workforce, as well as supporting strong and positive culture and leadership. What I'm most excited about, though, is that while targets are being met, and that is very, very important, there's a much, much deeper process that's happening here at Mind. It's one of learning and shifting and questioning, moving beyond the things that we do to the how and why of change. Lived experience workforce culture and leadership provides us with alternative to models and frameworks that dominate our systems, namely clinical and corporate models. They enable concepts of power and privilege to be at the centre, to critically reflect on and challenge social and cultural notions of work, culture and leadership completely. And in doing so, provide a model that is rooted in collaborative approaches to social justice and change. The culture, leadership and workforce activities that we're talking about today have been a culmination of 18 months' work, and there's been two major enablers. First on, we engaged Dr. Louise Byrne very early in the strategy delivery. Louise is recognised internationally as a thought leader in the area of lived experience workforce development, with arguably the largest body of work on this topic globally and a research program spanning 14 years. She's held expert and advisory roles and led policy development at state and national levels, including the development of the National Lived Experience Workforce Development Guidelines. Those guidelines are the basis for the work that we're doing here, both in the review of current activities and in defining what is needed going forward. Louise's role here at Mind has been transformative for this work. She brings a deep, deep discipline knowledge and is incredibly and unapologetically committed to change that is evidence-informed. Her independent evidence-informed advice and consultancy has moved us beyond those conversations that are about day-to-day organisational decision-making and processes and relationships. And it also makes sure that we don't fall into the trap, which I see happening in lived experience work, of seeing it as new and different and therefore open to interpretation and opinions and perspectives. There's a clear body of evidence that we need to draw from and work from and integrate into our systems. The other key enabler for us in the way we have engaged has been the process undertaken by Mind's executive and more senior leadership group of deep reflection and planning that has required genuine engagement with the gaps that exist in our organisation, as well as exploring drivers of change. What that means, as we know, with any change work, is there has to be moments of deep discomfort where we acknowledge what's not working, where we acknowledge some of the ways that we might be thinking that may not be enabling a process that take us forward. I have nothing but deep respect for the commitment and engagement I've seen across the leadership group here at Mind. The delivery of the plan that Louise will talk you through shortly is a full-scale approach to workforce and culture development that ensures that as we progress in lived experience leadership and peer-led innovation, our core lived expertise workforce are supported, developed and understood. The delivery of the plan will include additional executive advisory in the family carer space, new lived experience workforce roles and increased peer supervision and support. Over time, all of this will be delivered through lived experience governance models that both drive lived experience-led principles and practices while ensuring effective integration and whole of organisation responsibility, knowledge and approach. In conclusion, I want to acknowledge the broader lived expertise workforce at Mind for your contribution. For many decades in the development of the strategy and for your frank and fearless advice to me, to Louise and to others across the organisation about what we can do better. There is a strong and clear commitment to speaking up for change. That work is hard and I thank you and acknowledge all that you do in your work every day. Also to our allies in this organisation who are aplenty. They are enabling us to go from conversations that move beyond why we might do this, but to how we do this and when we do this. And for that, I'm really deeply proud. It is now my pleasure to welcome Louise, who will walk you through in more detail the work we've done together today and where to from here. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Katie. I just want to preface my presentation with saying I'm feeling really quite emotional today. Anthony was a dear friend. Katie is a dear friend who I am so proud of, and particularly her sharing today just came so much from the heart. She chose to make herself vulnerable, and I think that's a real metaphor for the whole journey that we've been on here with mine. I'm off script right now, folks, but I just feel so stirred and full in this moment, and so proud to be a part of this. If you don't mind going to my slide, Keegan, thank you. And then we'll just jump straight to the next one. Thank you. The next slide is great. So on the official track again, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're respectively meeting. In my case, I'm up here in beautiful Dalrymple country in central Queensland, where I have the privilege of living and working. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and those still emerging, and I promise to walk softly on these unceded lands with respect for all First Nations people. I'd like to acknowledge all First Nations people in attendance today. I would also like to acknowledge all the folk attending today who have their own significant lived experience, and to pay respect to the giants who came before us, upon whose broad shoulders we now stand, and particularly to Anthony. Next slide, please. So who am I? For anyone who's not aware, I'm a person with lived and living experience of a colourful range of adverse life experiences, including mental health challenges. I also live with physical disability. For those who may be vision impaired, I'm a woman in my mid-40s, light-skinned with long brown hair and glasses, and I answer to she and they. I've intentionally drawn from my lived experience in youth work and mental health positions since the mid-1990s, and been employed in a range of designated lived experience roles across the sector since 2005. Next slide, please. So Mind's lived experience strategy, as you're aware, launched in December 21 with a clear set of deliverables for Mind to achieve over the next 3 years. My role, as Katie mentioned, as a lived experience executive advisor has been and is to assist in directly applying the evidence to guide the implementation of that strategy. And going forward, the focus is increasingly on capacity building internal Mind staff to ensure that what we do has good sustainability. The Lived Experience Workforce Project and Plan, of course, follows on from the lived experience strategy and puts practical actions and timelines in place to get things done. The plan is evidence-based, informed by and in alignment with the National Lived Experience Workforce Development Guidelines, and provides easy to follow steps and resources to create consistency across the organisation and to maximise the effectiveness of lived experience roles at Mind. Aligning these processes with the evidence demonstrates fidelity with national policy. It utilises the authority of that national policy and the international evidence base. Most importantly, it supports a thriving lived experience workforce. In my time here so far, I've had many conversations and consultations with folks working in a vast diversity of role types at different levels of the organisation, and an independent formal gaps analysis was also conducted. We then cross-referenced the findings and compared them. A number of key themes emerged, both strengths and areas for development. Today, I'm going to run through some of the actions based on the best practice research that are underway or planned to address these areas of development. Next slide, please, Keegan. Thank you. Underpinning the plan to grow a robust, well understood and accepted, authentic lived experience workforce at Mind is an understanding of the difference between folks who may happen to have a lived experience and those who have taken the time to build their lived expertise. Adequately resourced and supported designated roles where people use their lived experience, their lived expertise as core to their job roles, help facilitate meaningful opportunities for consumer and carer participation at all levels of empowerment, which in turn contributes to meaningful impact and best practice outcomes. There are many ways people with individual lived experience can participate and contribute, and all types of lived experience are valuable and valued. However, it is the lived experience or lived expertise workforce that provides an advanced understanding of collective lived experience perspective and practice to help facilitate better communication and understanding between people accessing services, their families and significant others, and the organisation and representatives of the organisation. Lived expertise informs designated lived experience work and includes how both individual and, as you'll see on the screen, collective experiences and impacts are understood and then utilised to benefit others. This is key. The plan we're discussing today is on the designated lived experience workforce at Mind. So we're talking to and about those folks who are employed specifically to utilise their lived expertise. Next slide, please. On the screen is a snapshot of what the research broadly tells us the key challenges are in truly embedding lived experience across organisations and the sector. Like every other multidisciplinary environment, some of these challenges exist or existed at Mind as identified during my consultations here, as well as part of the independent gaps analysis. We use the aligned findings from both processes to inform what areas to focus on and in what order, i.e. what was most urgently needed. At the heart of embedding lived experience rather than fitting lived experience into the existing system are strategies to protect and maintain authentic lived experience perspective and practice. Central to these strategies is employment of lived experience leadership roles across all levels of the organisation and at all authority levels. This is non-negotiable. We need these roles to ensure lived experience perspectives with the ability to provide impact are included in all decision-making, from concept design through all stages of delivery and evaluation. To allow these leadership roles to be effective, it's essential to ensure via the recruitment process that people hired for the roles have deep lived experience discipline knowledge and the skills to help guide lived experience workforce development. Employing these leadership roles at all levels in turn builds capacity to ensure accessibility of lived experience-led supervision, to provide role clarity for all designated lived experience workers, and to create career pathways to help avoid brain drain, i.e. skilled lived experience workers going elsewhere for promotion. And we know that this is an increasing issue across our sector. As you've already heard, Mind is already advertising for a lived experience executive role. Woo! But wait, that's not all. Next slide, please. I am happy to say I'm not going to have time to explain all the strategies and actions of the plan in detail today. And I'm happy about that because the reason I can't do it is the plan includes a comprehensive pathway with multi-layered strategies spanning 3 key areas, and we simply won't have time to do it justice. What I would say is this plan meets many of the benchmarks of the national guidelines in a coordinated, sustainable way and demonstrates a highly evolved level of commitment and long-term investment from Mind. So the 3 key areas, as you can see, are maintaining and enabling authentic lived experience practice, recruitment and HR policies and processes that align with lived experience principles and practice and therefore support that authentic lived experience practice, and overall workplace culture and values that accepts lived experience throughout the organisation, including designated lived experience roles, but also valuing the lived experience of all staff and everyone who walks through the doors, either metaphorically or physically. To continue taking all of this forward and drive implementation of the plan, a project working group is in formation. The group already includes senior leaders and some key partners. It will grow, and it's an emphasis on a partnership model, inclusive of all stakeholders and guided by lived experience leaders. Next slide, please. This project working group will also be responsible for development of a formal lived experience workforce policy. The policy will include actions taken as a result of recent reviews on peer training requirements, peer supervision requirements and expectations, and a range of other areas for development as identified through the gaps analysis and my work here. There are a range of exciting new initiatives being explored, with progress already underway to provide additional supports for peer supervision and role clarity, as well as committed funding for new lived experience leadership roles and the potential to designate some existing leadership roles. All of this will assist in ensuring lived experience workers across the organisation are enabled and confident to work in ways that has fidelity to broader, established lived experience concepts and practice, and ultimately to provide the best practice outcomes. Next slide, please. Understanding what any role should achieve or contribute to, and the skills and knowledge that requires is, of course, essential to employ the right person with the necessary skills and experience to be successful in any role. Effective recruitment processes, including meaningful position descriptions, are identified in the literature as a critical factor in building a thriving lived experience workforce. At Mind, a number of commitments have been made to enable this, all accessible via a centralised contact point in the form of another new leadership level lived experience role. This role will have a number of key features and responsibilities, including to finalise and formalise the lived experience designated recruitment procedure, liaise directly with people and culture or human resources and hiring managers across the whole organisation, deliver training for hiring managers, anyone who's going to be looking at employing lived experience or contributing to the design of lived experience position descriptions on understanding lived expertise and lived experience work. Assisting hiring managers to find relevant lived experience workforce representatives for interview panels. Also included in this aspect of the plan is training for lived experience workers so that they feel enabled to participate on relevant recruitment panels for lived experience roles. There is also a detailed lived experience recruitment pack that will be widely available via the Mind intranet to help guide hiring managers and relevant others to understand the uniqueness of lived experience roles, including the difference between consumer and family care informed work, the need for and how to design specializations, and ultimately how to define the purpose of the role in order to design effective position descriptions. Next one, please. Central to a thriving lived experience workforce is a workplace culture that understands, values, and accepts lived experience. A key enabler the research has identified to achieve this is both top-down and bottom-up commitment throughout the organisation. This starts with engaging senior leadership and expands to encompass whole of workforce literacy and valuing of lived experience and lived expertise. As Katie mentioned, I've been meeting with the exec regularly for around 18 months now, and we have gone on a journey together, starting with building trust and understanding, creating space in which there were no wrong opinions or questions, but permission to call out the elephants in the room and then move towards a deeper shared understanding. This took an enormous amount of courage on everyone's part. Applause for that. And then recently, as part of this, and to underpin the communication strategies that will be later rolled out, we've worked together on defining the why of lived experience commitment at Mind. All members of the exec liaised with their teams and really dug deep to find messages that resonate and remind us all why lived experience is so important and central. We're then going to use those messages in a range of ways to keep everyone's hearts and minds clear and on track. Broader workplace cultural change management will also include whole of workforce training for all staff. We've already made a little start on that, so that all staff coming into the organisation from orientation on, as well as part of annual refresher training, will have a better understanding and therefore valuing of lived experience roles. We have already begun and will continue to deliver a variety of tailored information development and planning sessions for execs and senior leadership for all areas of the organisation to deepen understanding, valuing and commitment, and to increase lived experience literacy. There are also a number of communication strategies which will flow from the executive and senior leadership through to all staff to help promote contemporary, lived experience compatible concepts of mental health and to improve the psychological safety and acceptance for all staff. Next slide, please. So that's sort of phase one in a nutshell. In addition, we have a clear direction for the second phase, again, drawing from the identified gaps, the evidence base, and aligned to the national guidelines. While phase one workplace cultural change management strategies will be a significant start, the research indicates additional strategies are likely needed to truly embed valuing and acceptance of lived expertise across all levels and all areas of the organisation. The additional strategies will be explored for possible implementation, likely in 24-25. In addition to the training already mentioned on the value and functions of lived experience for all staff from orientation on, there will also be a range of ways to look at creating opportunities for managers and team leaders to talk to and see lived experience workers in practice to gain a more hands-on sense of the differences and the benefits. There'll be potential for a range of strategies featuring lived experience designated staff members to help facilitate that culture in which everyone affected by mental health and other challenges feels safe to seek support and understanding from supervisors and feel accepted by colleagues. This is a particular passion of mine that Mind very much shares. A formal process of allyship will be explored, whereby potential allies and champions of lived experience will receive additional training and time can potentially be allocated in their work planning to increase understanding of lived experience, how to ally effectively, and to roll some of that out further throughout the organisation. There will be the development of some type of tool, which we haven't looked at yet, but we're going to progress over time, and the organisational leaders will then be able to use that to regularly check the cultural temperature of the environments that they're responsible for and see where is collaboration at, where is understanding at, where is valuing at, and what else might we need to do. So next slide, and that's my final slide. Overall, as you've no doubt picked up, Mind is planning and progressing a complex and comprehensive program of improvement that truly embeds lived experience where it belongs, at the centre, at the core of everything they do. That's a standing ovation from me, folks. Well done.
Thanks so much, Louise. What a great presentation. And apologies for not doing a woohoo noise earlier when referencing the executive director role. That's an oversight on my behalf, and I'll rectify it from this point onwards. But seriously, we've been so privileged to benefit from Louise and Katie's significant expertise at Mind, and I'm truly in awe of the way both of them are able to turn their personal experiences and vulnerabilities into strengths and importantly use those strengths to then go on and lead others. And I'm sure that sentiment is shared by staff across the organisation and beyond. Certainly if the chat's anything to go by, it absolutely is. So the good news is that's not the last we'll hear from Louise and Katie. They'll be sticking around as we move into the panel discussion for today's webinar, and they'll be also joined by Mind CEO Gill Callister again. And for the first time, we'll also get to hear from Mind's General Manager of Services in South Australia, Brett Williams. Katie will be returning to host that discussion. And before I throw to Katie, I just wanted to note that the chat has really been filled with some wonderful positive messages coming. So please keep them coming. But just a few that I pulled out included excited to see the commitment to a culture of lived experience at all levels, leadership that we can see, hear and aspire towards. Our future is now. It's so important to normalise these conversations, and it's all helping to reduce the stigma that surrounds mental ill health. Thank you so much for a fundamental shift towards incorporating lived experience so people with lived experience can use their unique skills and experience. This is wonderful. And two of my favourites so far, this is fantastic and gobsmackingly good. So keep them coming. And ensure that you've changed the blue box at the bottom to everyone if you want all attendees to see your comments. A few of them are coming through just to the panelists at the moment. And a final reminder to continue to use the Q&A section to add your questions as we move into the Q&A session. Katie will be putting your questions to the panel. So over to you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Tim, and nice to be back with everyone. So we have already got some questions coming through through Q&A, so we'll pick those up and we'll come to those shortly and keep them coming, because we've got plenty of time for this discussion today, and so we will privilege your questions as they come through, in addition to some questions we have for this group ourselves. So as Tim said, I'll be leading a panel with Louise, Gill and Brett today, and really excited to hear from all of them, and all of them bring really different and critical contributing parts of the work that we're doing here at Mine. So Gill, I might come to you first, and really as Mine CEO, such a critical role to play in this process, and without doubt one of a great ally for this work. And so I wanted to get your sense of why now? Why Mine's investment in this space? Why now? And what gives you the impetus to centre this as such a core of our work?
Thanks, Katie, and terrific presentation earlier. You know, I've been in this role for 3 years. So one of the things that really stood out to me early on was Mine's been on this journey for a long time. I'm not going to, you know, claim all the credit. I've really had, I think, the opportunity to build on the investment that's been made by many people over a long time in really trying to deepen our understanding of how to use lived experience and lived expertise across our organisation to essentially get better outcomes for people. So it's been a real opportunity for me to say, well, where do we go to? How do we build on that? And where do we go to next? And one of the first things I got to do, you know, in the first year that I was here was help you launch the lived experience strategy. And I do recall saying implementation is the thing, but it is. I've seen many strategies sit on shelves, as you said. And it strikes me that one of the things you really need in this work is both head and heart. And so the reason to have a strategy is to actually have a plan. Some of the things that Louise has helped us with that were in her presentation are to deeply and intentionally get into the fabric and culture and processes of the organisation so that we can actually measure what we're doing, but at the same time value it deeply at a personal level and a professional level, because I think the ultimate why for me is to get better and transformative outcomes for people who need to use mental health services, and for those outcomes to be very, very positive. And it is really clear from a lot of the evidence that engaging people with lived experience and expertise throughout the organisation, not just in service delivery, will help us get those outcomes. And let's face it, mental health is a system that has struggled with transformation and better outcomes for people for a long time. So I feel like I've been on this journey for the whole 3 years. It's been amazing to work with Louise and you and many people across our organisation, our board members. I've learned a lot as an ally. And I do think that this truly is the way that we start really getting those transformative outcomes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gill. Brett, I might come to you. You've done some incredible work in South Australia and really just pushed ahead with the development of new lived experience roles and thinking about the appropriate training and supports, particularly across leadership. I wanted to hear a bit from you, and I wonder if you can share with this group around why you took that approach and what the impact of that has been.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So I'll just start by saying that although I'm not in a lived experience designated role, I do have my own lived experience of mental health challenges and also as a carer of people with their own challenges. And my experience has been one of, my adverse challenges have led to me having to rebuild my life twice, and I can say that that was possible through the power of peer support, not traditional, I guess, approaches to dealing with mental health challenges. And so that's the grounding I bring into the work that I do. The strategy that I took on in South Australia was really quite simple. It occurred to me that our staff survey says that about 50% of our staff identify as having a lived experience, and that wasn't reflected in the number of lived experience designated roles or people declaring that openly. So I did two things. One was I started a program for staff who did have a lived experience who wished to transition into a peer practitioner role. And then I made the decision that all vacancies that occurred in programs would be advertised as peer practitioners. That coincided with us doing a proof of concept program in Northern Adelaide, which was 100% peer-led, delivered and evaluated. And that gave us a really good grounding on the other part that's necessary in that process is around providing the support and the training and the intentional space for peer practitioners to develop that authentic peer ways of working. And so over that sort of 2 year period, we've managed to increase in the programs that report through to me. Around about 58% of the service delivery staff are now designated peer practitioners, and of the people who report directly to me, 75% of them are in lived experience leadership roles. So some of the things we did to support that was access to Mind's peer program, access to a community of practice, additional supervision time, access to a monthly peer reflective practice session, quarterly peer forums, and also access to external training that aligns with peer work values and principles. And the impact that we saw there from staff has been, I think, phenomenal. They consistently report that they feel very well supported in their ability to operate authentically as peers, and they really appreciate being given that intentional space to be able to work on their professional development in that space. And one of the things we also decided to do, because we had some quite large tenders coming up and we wanted to make sure that we had that really strong grounding, is that we've started to roll intentional peer support out across our service delivery staff as well. And one of the things that came out of the Connect program that I think is really critical in this is around the need for organisations to absolutely support professional development for their peer workforce, but also their personal development, because we're asking that group to bring everything of themselves to work, and that lived experience doesn't stop the moment you get a job. You still are continuing in your own life and your own journey. And in order to support people to deliver that authentic peer work, we need to be an organisation that is supportive of both professional and personal development for that workforce.
Sorry about that, mute button issues. So thanks so much, Brett, doing incredible work. And I think it just, the work that Brett is doing in South Australia just goes to show what happens when you just take it on and look at the how, and don't wait for instructions. So really appreciate the work you're doing, because it's giving us a great platform to think nationally as well. Louise, if I can come to you, we've had a question. We've got a lot of questions coming through the Q&A, so keep them coming. And just to cover off a little bit of a housekeeping one, Louise is happy for those slides to be shared so we can make them available when we make the recording. Question in the chat is around lived experience roles in HR. And certainly this is something that we have talked about with the Workforce Project Plan and tried to understand that integration. And there's that discussion around sitting roles in specific departments or having them in lived experience divisions. Just wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about what the evidence says around this and some guidance for anyone thinking about lived experience HR roles.
Yeah, firstly, I would say that human resources or people in culture understanding and being on board, valuing lived experience is critical. So this is what we focused on first, actually. We started working in a co-design process with people in culture and human resources within people in culture to ensure that we were really looking at people's knowledge and understanding, but ultimately what was the process organisation-wide. So there's a couple of things, like one, do it. One, make sure that you've got as much lived experience informed kind of interaction and collaboration happening as possible, because it's not just about lived experience position descriptions, it's also about the way that policies and processes for the entire organisation are written and revised, and whether they do or do not create an environment in which lived experience workers can feel safe and do their work in authentic ways, but also how those processes, policies, and ultimately the culture of the organisation contributes or inhibits the ability to create a psychologically safe environment for all staff, as well as, and probably in some ways most importantly, people accessing services, their family and significant others. So there's a whole swathe of issues that need to be addressed. To that question more specifically, should the lived experience worker sit in HR? It depends. What I saw in the US happening was more typically, if you had particularly like one lived experience role, one or two in a larger organization or team, that it was better for them to physically reside, or, you know, if it's mostly an online workspace, be co-located so there's freezing. I'm just seeing a comment, I'm getting distracted by it, but I'm just going to keep talking anyway. There can be there's great benefit in the lived experience personnel being present and part of the everyday, you know, workings and conversations that happen within any area within the organisation, including HR. But there are also risks, drains and demands on the lived experience worker if they are sitting within an area that predominantly does not share the same discipline, it has an emerging understanding of their work and of their perspective. So what typically happens in the States for multidisciplinary organisations is that lived experience workers are employed by often a peer-led organisation or an organisation with strong expertise in that area, and then they're co-located. So we've suggested a similar kind of setup for Mind, in that leadership position that I referred to earlier, who is going to work so closely with HR, and their whole role is really about that. They will spend enormous amounts of time with HR, but their role supervision, their line management, and their debriefing, etc., will largely happen with lived experience colleagues, which we feel sort of ticks both boxes. If it's okay, Katie, I would just also, I think I was going to touch briefly on what both Gill and Brett said, and I will be brief. One of the things I just want to credit the executive with, anybody who knows me knows that I'm pretty straightforward. So they demonstrated and had to commit to a willingness to sit with discomfort repeatedly, and at times to sit with hearing things that frankly I think made people feel pretty flat and discouraged. That wasn't my intention, but you know, there are times when, you know, gaps or areas of development, especially when you're, you know, really trying to climb a mountain, it can feel, you know, frankly a bit of a bummer. And the executive for like 18 months now have sat with that process, have participated incredibly, you know, with a great engagement, every single member of the executive. So I think that's really exciting and important, and it's something that I would like other organisations to be thinking about. It's not even enough to get your CEO on board. The entire senior leadership needs to understand this, and it needs to be driven in a customised way through every section, every portfolio of the organisation, which is exactly what Mind is doing. The other thing is there was enormous support, existing support from many general managers across the organisation, which makes a huge difference, because it's that sort of, I don't know if second tier is the correct way to say it, but you know, that senior leaders who are really on the ground and doing more of the support and the supervision and the rolling out of budgets, etc. There was already a very strong sense of the value of this work from having seen lived experience workers doing their thing. The only other thing that I'd like to say is that what Brett was referring to is so important to increase lived experience presence, along with a parallel process of increasing lived experience literacy and valuing, as well as increasing understanding of concepts of mental health and social and emotional well-being that are culturally and lived experience appropriate. It's all part of the same picture. So even though we're zeroing in on lived expertise today and how important lived expertise workers are as a facilitator, as a driver, as a bridge of communication, it is, the ultimate goal is always about valuing lived experience, everybody's lived experience in a range of different ways, and the way that people bring that to work or don't bring that to work, the way that people walking through the doors feel when they arrive, and the fact that you cannot have safe service access if there is still stigma within your other mental health professions that you're organising. If there are folks in your organisation who are afraid to let their supervisor know that they have mental health challenge, then that is trickling down, and at some point there are folks walking through that door incredibly vulnerable who are there in their darkest hour, who are going to be impacted in the wrong way by that attitude. So I really applaud again that Mind has taken that on. Like, this is not just about the lived experience workforce, although that is the driver, the critical feature, but the big picture goal is about how do we make sure that our services are genuinely helpful, genuinely safe, and that everybody who engages with Mind feels that. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. So I just want to touch on a question that came through, which I think I'll just briefly answer. There was a question around how do we choose the 20% target for workforce, lived experience workforce growth. That was based on, we were hearing, I guess, through VMIAC and through other consumer groups, around 30% being the ideal post the delivery of the Royal Commission in Victoria. We felt that in a 3-year period, we needed to match growth with quality. So wanted to ensure that the target enabled us to build systems and structures around supporting the workforce appropriately, which is actually been really key. So what we're seeing is we're working on the quality, and we're actually quite organically seeing that growth. We haven't proactively sought growth at this point, but we will do so. But we will do so when we are comfortable that we've got all of the systems set up to actually support adequately a lived expertise workforce. Now, a question came through about what have been the challenges of delivering the strategy, and I think what would be really good to hear from each of our panellists is some thoughts around some of the challenges that have been in place and how we've overcome them from each of the different perspectives. So, Brett, I might start with you. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on challenges of delivery of the strategy, or just broadly how your lived experience workforce growth approaches.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I mean, I think at that service delivery level, there are several sort of core challenges that impact. They are quite systemic as well, and a little bit hard to influence at that systems level, service delivery level. One of the issues, I guess, is the basic qualification, the Cert 4 and mental health peer work, quite often doesn't fit with the scope of some of the programs that we're trying to deliver. So that sort of places a burden on the organisation to fill that training gap, and we obviously have limited resources to do that. So there's a bigger system piece around, different sort of pathways into that professionalisation of lived expertise in the workplace. And I think that's key. A lot of the structures of our contracts and programs can be a bit of a barrier to authentic peer work. There's often that tension between the sort of dominant paradigm and being able to support peer workers to maintain that sort of authentic peer work against some of those tensions can be quite challenging at times. And you can't really increase your peer workforce without, as I think a number of people have already said, equipping program leadership with the knowledge and confidence around having a greatly increased number of peer practitioners in their peer workforce. And sitting alongside of that is making sure that they have access to supervision around the development of those skills, but also that where you've got peer workers reporting through to someone who may not be in a lived experience designated role, that there is access to some specialised peer reflective practice as well. That's really important. We need to understand that peer workers need at times that specialised space to actually explore peer work, and so that can be quite challenging too.
Louise?
Thanks, Katie. I think probably I mean, the core barriers that the research has found, and mine is just like everywhere else, are effectively attitudinal. So, and those attitudes come from understanding or lack thereof. So that is why one of our big foci has been around the development of senior lived experience leadership roles who can be there to increase people's understanding and therefore their valuing. Anyone who's read my work probably knows about the sort of cycle that we identified, which is that if folks are exposed to lived experience work, there's a very natural increase in understanding, increase in valuing, and ultimately an increased commitment to, actually do things. So that is all really important and underway. But I would say it's the biggest barrier in that your whole workforce needs to get on board. Your whole workforce needs to get it, and your whole workforce needs to work together to create an environment, a culture, service delivery, ethos, philosophy, what have you, that really reflects lived experience perspectives and concepts, because lived experience perspectives and concepts are a diluted, refined form of how the folks on the ground accessing the service with their families and significant others see and feel and experience. So it's about the end user and making sure that the end user gets what they need and what they want. But bigger than that, like if I think about, that's all stuff you can affect change on as an organisation if you choose to, as Mind has, put enough time and energy into it. The bigger barrier, which Brett also referred to, is around funding. So the guidelines for funding. So again, just going back to that people and culture piece, that HR piece, one of the ways that you can address existing funding is if, and I've seen this again in the States, organisations where the HR or people and culture unit were really on board, really got lived experience, and they would go through funding guidelines with a fine-tooth comb to find the loopholes, to find the flexibility, to find the ways that funding could be used more creatively to allow for lived experience positions and the resources that lived experience positions need. So again, another big tick why we need our people and culture and HR to really get it. The other thing that I've been talking to Mind a lot about, and I think Gill was already very aware of this, as are others, is we need as a sector to advocate back to funders. Funders are not the be all and end all. They just happen to be the people who, for whatever reason, were interested in that particular type of job, and they've done it. Doesn't mean they know much about how service delivery actually runs, and it definitely doesn't mean they know about lived experience roles. We need to be educating our funders, and that needs to be an ongoing piece. I guess the other thing I would say is, and I do this, people probably see me with general emails go out at times. Sometimes we need to say no. If a funding guideline is just absolute rubbish, if the timelines are rubbish, if the way that lived experience is described doesn't allow for authentic practice, we need to say and let them know we will not participate in this bid because you are you're going over the boundaries of what is appropriate for lived experience work, and or this is not a safe or healthy way for people to engage with work. We are all living in an incredibly fast-paced culture right now across the sector, and these last-minute bids and complex funding strategies and all the rest of it with no pushback, well, they're not going to change what they're doing if we don't put a firm line on it. And my way of doing that is encouraging other people to give feedback, to advocate consistently back to funders, to make time to yarn with funders, so it's not all reactive, but to spend time if they're willing to, but also at the end of the day to say no when the funding is unreasonable and the timelines or the design of it is going to jeopardise or put at risk staff within the organisation.
Thanks so much, Louise. And such a critical point to be thinking through is the aspect around funding, because it can be such a block where the thinking is ahead. In the work that we're doing, is the thinking is ahead of where the funding guidelines indicate we need to be. So really powerful suggestions. Gill, if I can come to you from your perspective across the executive group and across the organisation as a whole, what do you see have been some of the challenges of implementing the lived experience strategy, and where do we go to from here with those?
Yeah, and look, I, at the risk of labouring the point, I just want to touch on funding as well, because this requires investment. It requires investment of time, of people. You know, as was announced, we're having a lived experience executive position. These things cost money. No one wants to pay for that. I don't see, very occasionally we see in contracts, particularly ones that are actually about lived experience leadership in a program such as some of the ones Brett's piloted in South Australia. And we see increasingly in some tenders sort of lip service paid to this, but the idea from state and federal governments, from PHNs, from others, that this is something that you deeply invest in as an organisation in order to deliver them the outcomes they're trying to purchase, it just hasn't really hit home. It's a little bit still the right thing to do, to mention lived experience in a tender or ask you what your commitment is, or recognise that you have someone on your interview panel with lived experience, but I'm not sure there's a very deep understanding of the resourcing, the effort, the deliberate prioritisation that has to happen in order for lived experience and expertise to be truly, to do that work in an organisation, and to do it from one end of the organisation to the other, which doesn't mean just having representative positions on boards or other things, notwithstanding that that is a good thing to do. So, you know, I think that is a really serious issue, and I think it's definitely one of the reasons a number of organisations haven't moved further, and perhaps would want to. The second one is really to pick up on Louise's point, and it's the leadership issue. And again, got to invest time in that, but it has to be across the leadership of the organisation. Can't just be the CEO. Does need to be the executive, even, you know, executives who are more in the corporate back of house, because it needs to be in the DNA. I think the other thing I'd just call out here, and we might come to it at some point into the future, but we can't, we talk about lived experience and lived expertise as if it's homogenous, and it isn't. You know, people bring different views. Communities of people that have something that binds them also have things they have different views about and disagree on and have different perspectives on. And so understanding as an organisation that you can't let disagreement or different views paralyse you. You need to keep moving forward, and you need to have a plan. You need to listen, but you will have to make decisions and continue to progress. And that doesn't mean you alienate people, but it may not mean that. It may also mean you don't make everybody absolutely happy all of the time, because after that listening, you do have to make decisions and keep moving. And just then, I think the other important thing, which I think Brett's touched on, and which I'm not sure that we've particularly thought too much about yet, but, you know, what is the career path for people with lived experience? People doing really important peer work, where is the career path as a peer worker to continue to evolve and develop your skills, and to be able to move around the service system and be valued in places that aren't just mine. Not that I want anyone leaving, don't get me wrong, but, you know, I've coming into this role, I did work in mental health policy many years ago, and was probably around the time that a number of the clinical services were developing the notion of consumer consultants. There'll be plenty of people on this webinar who know about the fight to get those positions, and coming back here many, many years later to this sector, finding that many of those services haven't moved from there at all. There are still some part-time consumer consultant roles, but that's sort of about it in a lot of places. So how do we really deepen and evolve career paths and opportunities for people to really participate in the workforce in the broadest sense?
Thanks, Jill. Great points. There's a number of questions and comments coming through talking about how do we navigate lived and living experience, what's the right language around this, but I think the core theme that's coming through is that really critical one of lived experience isn't always in the past. It can be very, very present. And it's not always easy to talk about it in the present for those of us in lived experience roles, because we don't want to see like we can't do things, what we need to do. So just curious to hear from our panelists how you think about that side of the work, that it's not in the past, that people have living experiences. And Louise, I might come to you first to sort of talk a little bit about what that balance is when we're thinking about a lived expertise workforce, in acknowledging and recognising living experience, and also creating the conditions for work. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks, Katie. Well, people have been pretty forthcoming today, so I'm just going to share the fact that I'm nearly profoundly deaf now, and I already had an acquired brain injury and all sorts of trauma and other adverse, awful stuff happen as a kid, and all sorts of mental health challenges. I'm, autistic, whatever. So I was already carrying a lot of living experience, and then like losing my hearing, and my entire central nervous system just shut down a couple of months ago when I started having to try and adjust to the hearing aid. So barely slept, hardly could eat. I deal with these things every day. I can't travel anymore since COVID, especially with the brain injury and with the being deaf and whatever. It's that tension of like, how does one work in this space effectively with a living experience? It is very real, but I don't know anyone who doesn't. Like, I don't know. It's just something that we manage. And I guess in terms of the language, lived and living, to me, when I say lived, I always mean living, because, I had to drag myself in here this morning. I did not have a good night's sleep, and it was not a good start to the day. Okay, so I do my face before I come on and amp up, and I'm glad that I've got some performance experience in the background. But when I say living, I mean like every minute of every day. My whole life is barriers. Really, I barely leave the house unaccompanied. I see it, it's like living experience is part and parcel of what we do. There may be folks, and I do know, I mean, I've met people over the time whose their predominant experience is in the past for them, but the majority of people that I know are still, climbing that mountain every day. It is just very much part of what we do. And I think that we demonstrate enormous resilience, but also creativity, and organisations who are able to be flexible with us. That's probably the most key thing. Like, allow us to come when we can come. And if we're like me, if you're like a, what would you say, like a binge worker, like you can get in and just smash a whole bunch of stuff out, then allow for that. So the better, I guess it all sort of comes back to that understanding piece again, doesn't it? Like, the more deeply and the more intimately your experience and living experience is understood by the organisation, the more flexible and the more responsive and appropriate those HR processes and policies, etc., can be. One really exciting thing that we found actually in the research is that when flexibility is addressed on behalf of the lived experience component of the workforce, there was natural flow-on benefit to the entire workforce, which is pretty exciting, because what that means is the workplace is moving towards being more human-friendly for everyone. I don't know if there's anything else really to say about that. I know some people feel that we should say lived and living every time, but for me at least, because I write it and say it like about 15,000 times a day, I am more in the habit of the shorthand version, but I always mean living. And what I recommend is that if you've got documents like the What is Our Why, which we're just polishing off at the moment, to start off with lived and living, So it's acknowledge, and then just sort of sporadically throw it in, but don't use the wordiest, most verbose version every time, because part of what we want to do is, it's psychological, it's sales, it's PR. You want messages to stick in people's heads. You don't want them to be like, that sounds a bit PC, that sounds a bit, like whatever. That you want them to get it and hold on to it and refer to it later on. You want it to make sense and you want it to stick.
Thanks, Louise. Powerful words. Brett, did you want to make a comment on this, that balance, particularly working with, with large lived experience teams, but also recognising it happens across the workforce, that balance of lived and living experience?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Louise said, and kind of what I said earlier as well. You have to marry that professional development and that personal development around providing, supportive workplaces. I think another thing to recognise as well, though, I mean, I think Mind as an organisation, we understand the intrinsic value of lived experience and lived expertise. And by supporting our workforce to utilise that to guide people on their personal journey, what we also see is the expertise and the people that we're supporting provides an opportunity for ourselves to learn and to grow. And the strength of delivering authentic peer work lies in that mutuality, collaboration, and relationship. And authentic peer support is not about capacity building. It's about a shared journey of discovery, reimagining, and respect. And it's not about outcomes, treatment, or management. It's about the power that a shared experience has to transform and redefine. And that as actually that mutuality, as that goes both ways. So by doing peer work, you're actually working on yourself at the same time. So you get paid to to reimagine your own life at the same time as you get paid to help other people. So in that way, it's a win-win.
Love it. Don't let the secret out, Brett. Gill, do you have any comments on this around lived and living experience and how to navigate that within the organisation support and across culture?
Well, I think it's just understanding. I don't think we have to come up with definitions that cover everything, because I think some people do have lived and living experience, and some it's lived. And don't forget the phrase lived expertise is also very, very important. I know we have some people with lived experience in non-designated roles, and then we have people who have really worked very much to build their lived experience into expertise that they bring to the role. And all these perspectives are useful and valuable in an organisation. Yeah, that's probably all I would say on that at the moment. Katie?
Excellent. I might just come to, thanks, Gill. I might just come to thinking around education and training. We've had various questions come through the Q&A about the types of education and training that are necessary, some feedback on Mind's own training model and how it could be improved. Really, I guess, interested to hear, and Brett, I might come to you first about what your experiences are of training a lived expertise workforce, and then Louise, I'll come to you on that, and also sort of broader workforce training. So Brett, if I can start with you and your comments on that, what's necessary from an education and training perspective.
Yeah, from my perspective, the strategy that I developed, maybe put the cart before the horse. There's been some comments about get the framework right and then increase the numbers. I kind of did the opposite. I increased the numbers and then thought I probably should have a framework to make this viable. So that was around, our own internal training, providing that, as I say, that intentional space, but also accessing, there's a lot of great training out there from external providers that are really aligned with the values and principles of peer work, and look at things from a different perspective. And I think that's a really important part of the training for a lived experience workforce. It's not just necessarily about the utilisation of your lived expertise, but it's also about the growing body of evidence out there around alternative ways to deal with a lot of things. So, for instance, we're involved in the pilot of the alternatives to suicide here in South Australia, which is a very different way of looking at a very serious and prominent problem across Australian society. And so giving our peer practitioners access to that training and allowing them the time to do some of that stuff, in addition to the work that they do for us, is really important. And that adds to the value that they bring to the organisation, because it really just embeds them into that greater sort of potpourri of what's actually available out there that is not based on that dominant sort of medical paradigm. And that's part of the training that we need to do, is helping people to move away from that, to feel supported in doing that, and to build our own evidence base around the effectiveness of that and the work that we do.
Thanks, Brett. Louise, your thoughts around training for the lived experience workforce, but also more broadly for workforces around understanding lived experience work?
Sure. So certainly in the national guidelines, we spoke a lot about the need for sector-wide training. This ad hoc kind of nonsense that's been happening for a long time, and that is still happening in some places, is never going to get the sort of full-scale acceptance and understanding and valuing of lived experience and lived expertise that is needed for us to move forward on our national reform goals. What we do need is for every student of any mental health profession or associated professions that are going to work with folks accessing services, every single person in every bachelor, in every master's, in every higher degree, to be learning about lived experience and lived expertise from lived experience experts all the way through their degree. The great shame, I think, in this country right now is that despite the attention that we've been paying to lived experience, there are only a handful of courses across the mental health professions, across the mental health disciplines, where there is any representation from lived experience. And then that number becomes even smaller when we talk about actual courses being led by or coordinated by lived experience folk. So what this means is, even if, say in Victoria, we are having a whole of sector rollout of education around lived experience, which I believe is in progress and should be led by a lot of the evidence that we've already found in the national guidelines in terms of strategies. If all of our new graduates coming out are hearing about lived experience for the first time when they put their foot inside the door of the service, then we're going to have to do that work all over again with every new generation. So what we need is a whole of sector training for everybody, yes. We also need for our mental health professions to take greater responsibility for the way that they are being proactive or not in terms of the registered training, the accreditation that exists, and ensuring that lived experience is embedded within that training. The other thing I would say, because people talk about like formal pathways to training for lived experience and peer work a lot, and that is very important, but it's going to remain limited in some places. So what I'm going to just give is like an alternate strategy today, which was my own strategy. I was the first ever paid lived experience worker in Central Queensland. And Central Queensland, if you don't know, is like 700 kilometres away from the nearest capital city, right? So it's cattle country, folk. It's the beef capital, literally the beef capital of this country. So when I started those roles in the late 90s and then again in the mid 2000s, the understanding and the access to training was completely non-existent. But what we can do and have to do, unfortunately, in some cases, I'm not advocating for this as an end goal, but I'm just saying if you're in one of those areas where training is not widely available, it is possible to self-educate. I was poring over the Intentional Peer Support website for years before I finally had the privilege of training with Sherry and Chris back in 2010 and 2011. And everything I did, in a shabbier way, but still what I did was informed by IPS a long time before I actually got that training. The other really big thing, and I think this is critical, like formal training can do all sorts of things, but at its guts, what does that formal training do? What I believe that formal training does is helps us undo the brainwashing that we experience within the system or just within society in terms of attitudes people have to folks with mental health and other challenges. So what I see is our core point of difference that we need to be addressing every day, with or without formal training, is recognizing increasingly as we go on our lived experience journey, as Brett was saying, you're doing the work, but you're also learning and growing, increasing what was foisted on me, like what in the way that I think and view and do was forced upon me by attitudes and beliefs that I do not actually align with, whether that's from the system or just from society generally, because of the crappy attitudes people often still hold about folks like us who struggle at times. And how can I shift that to something that is more useful and helpful? And how can I draw on the existing body of work, and whether that's, you know, grabbing stuff from the internet, yarning with your mates who also work in lived experience roles or what have you, to challenge and to build an alternate narrative that then informs the way that you do and think every day in your role.
Thanks so much, Louise. Now, there's lots of questions, lots of comments coming through, and we've only got a few minutes left. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things which won't adequately respond to all of them, but we'll hopefully pick up on a few things people have asked. So there was a question around evaluation. So I just wanted to highlight this will be a critical next phase of the delivery of the strategy, and working with our research and evaluation team about evaluating the strategy itself, as well as specific activities that sit within it. There was also a question about family care workforce and where that sits at Mind. So absolutely crucial. It hasn't been where we've seen our highest numbers and highest levels of leadership to date, but that executive advisory role that will be coming in this year will help to start doing some of that readiness work at executive as well as the growth of family and carer roles through family and carer-led centres in Victoria, but more broadly also. I was going to touch on something else, but it's left my mind. So I might come to Gill now and just ask the question, where should an organisation start, and how is all of the work that we're connected to, how do we see that play out in services, and what's the core that we need to be thinking about? To come back to that point that you raised earlier, Gill, that the key outcome here is better outcomes for people who choose to access mental health services.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you have to start with a bit of an honest appraisal of where you are, I think, and you have to not over kind of tell yourself as an organisation, tell yourself that you're doing a great job here. You've got to kind of have a bit of an honest appraisal and say, where do we think we're strong and where do we have to do more? And I think, you know, that journey Mind's been on, the lived experience strategy that you created, Katie, with others obviously along the way, helped build on that. So we could have just rested on our laurels and said we're pretty good at this, but I do think you've got to have some humility, and you've got to be able to kind of really be accountable for how you're going to take things forward. And, you know, I saw the question about evaluation as well. And that is where we do need to be accountable for this. Like, how much of this are we able to deliver? Have we done it well? Could we do it better? I think it's a kind of a constant thing, but we will evaluate it and we will make that public because we are trying to help other people learn as well. And just that final point you made about services, I mean, Mind is largely a service delivery organisation. So we are here to provide a range of different services for people facing a range of different challenges. And I think to be true to this, you've got to be able to see the results in the outcomes for people. Are they having the outcomes they want and that they aspire to? And it is really important that it's rewarding for our staff as well along the way, but it also has to help people have the lives they value and want to have. And, you know, it was really interesting in February, and we don't have time to talk about this in detail, but a number of us, Katie, Deb, I know who's on here, we went to New Zealand to look at the lived experience-led services that are alternatives to acute care, and which we have the privilege here in Melbourne of being able to be engaged in the next stage of design of what a similar service might look like here in Victoria. And it was just, there's nothing quite so powerful as being there and meeting the people, the peers that staff those services, and the guests, as they're called, the people that are there to get support. And it just struck me as so extraordinarily different to going into an acute clinical service. Now, it may not be for everyone all of the time, but it struck me that it, all of those very obvious power structures that are there in inpatient units, whether it's the staff or the physical environment, were stripped away, and the service provided was highly relational, and it was really kind of turning stuff on its head. And I just, you know, you could not but be really blown away by how much that dynamic made a difference to people in such a positive way. And that's the kind of thing I think ultimately we've got to keep looking for.
Thanks, Gill. Now, panellists, we've got very little time, so just final comments. Brett, if I can come to you first for final comments on where should an organisation start, or any other parting comments you want to make today. Got about a minute.
At the risk of stealing someone else's logo, just do it. Like, I mean, you can take that comprehensive approach, but you can actually also start small. There is a lot of stuff out there around how to support a lived experience workforce. So if as an organisation you want to go down that path, you can just start by hiring some peer workers and building those supports around them. If you wait until everything is in place and perfect, you can often miss an opportunity to start to actually deliver really beneficial services to the people that are coming to you for support by delaying what is, you know, by far the most effective way to support people in that mental health space, which is through that lived experience workforce.
Thanks, Brett. And Louise, final comments. And Louise, if you get a moment, just pop into the chat your lived experience leadership website. I think that would be really helpful for people too, just from a couple of the comments that have been coming through around best evidence.
Yeah. No worries, I'll pop it in. It's livedexperienceleadership.com.au, and then I'll chuck it in. So what organisations need to do: be honest, be humble, be willing to change, be creative in finding resources, and remember, as Gill's heard me say a number of times, no one wins the lived experience workforce development lottery. You've got to dig deep, as Mind has. Be prepared to put your money where your mouth is and your time where your mouth is, and then you will build, you know, the workforce-wide valuing.
Thanks, Louise. Fine and fierce words, as always. Thank you so much to all of our panel, Brett, Louise, Gill, for the conversation. Thank you to everyone participating on chat. I'll now hand back over to Tim to wrap us up today.
Thanks, Katie. And yes, thanks to all our speakers and to the hundreds of people who tuned in today for your continued interest in amplifying lived expertise to drive reform and transformational change. Apologies we weren't able to get to all of your questions. They were coming through thick and fast, but if you'd like more information from any of our presenters, feel free to reach out via the email you received from Mind or email communications@mindaustralia.org.au. A number of you asked, and yes, we will make today's webinar and slides available via email to all who registered, and the recording will also be available on Mind's YouTube channel. We'll also have a summary news article out on the Mind website and social media channels in the near future too. And a reminder to keep an eye out for more information on the Anthony Stratford Lecture and Scholarship in the near future. I'll leave you with what I thought was an important message from Katie today, which I think will resonate with our audience for some time. Katie said, rather than hiding my lived experience so I could work, my lived experience is essential so that I can work. That's the real power of lived experience work, amplifying experience as truth. Thank you.